He hadn't eaten in 2 days. She hadn't cried in 3. The sheriff wanted justice. The town wanted entertainment. Before we dive deeper into this twisted story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and enjoy. But the tracker, he just saw a boy who wouldn't stop reaching for hope, even with shackles on. The auction block stood crooked on the back of a flatbed cart, splintered stained with dust and pride. Half the town of Deadwood Gulch gathered that morning in the square, jaws tight, eyes hungrier than they had any right to be. Some came to mock, some came to spit, some came with coins, hoping to leave with a lesson. The sheriff stood tall on the platform, hand resting on his belt, chin high like a man who thought himself judge, jury, and shepherd of righteousness. But it wasn't a man standing beside him. It was a boy, 9, maybe 10, barefoot, ribs showing through a torn cotton shirt. Brown hair clumped with sweat. Dirt smeared across his cheeks like bruises he never had the chance to wash off. His wrists were bound with rusted iron cuffs that had no place on a child. But what stopped everyone, what made the murmurs hush for a single breath, wasn't his appearance. It was the bundle he clutched close to his chest, swaddled in a ripped feed sack. The baby. She couldn't have been more than a few months old, her head covered in soft, dark curls, eyes closed against the wind, too tired or too weak to protest. Her little arm dangled free, limp. "Name's Billy," the sheriff called out, not bothering to ask if it was true. "Caught stealing from Morrison's smokehouse last night. Half a ham, jar of preserves, and a sack of flour." Laughter rippled from the crowd. A boy stealing flour seemed worth a chuckle, but Billy didn't flinch. He only tightened his grip on the baby, angling his body to shield her from the wind. "It was for his sister," the sheriff continued, spitting off the side of the wagon. "We'll see if that holds up. Either way, we don't tolerate thievery in Deadwood Gulch." Town council agreed. Boys old enough to be punished like a man. Punished. That was the word they used. Now there'd been no trial, no questions, just a crowd and a hammer and a rule that said orphans didn't count for much. They couldn't jail him, too young, couldn't hang him, not without backlash from the circuit judge. But there was one thing the town loved as much as order: spectacle. So the sheriff took bids. "Auction starts at $1, he called. $1 buys his debt. You take him home, feed him, work him till he's paid what he owes. Girl comes with." Billy didn't speak. His face was stiff with defiance, but his knees shook beneath him. He held the baby closer. From the crowd, a merchant raised his hand. $2, he said, smirking. "Looks like he can carry a sack of grain." "3, said another man. "I'll put him in the barn with the goats." 6. Each voice stacked heavier on the boy's shoulders. The sheriff called out the numbers like a barker pushing whiskey. 7. "Do I hear 8? Then from the edge of the square, a voice cut clean through the noise. 10. The bidding stopped. Heads turned. The sheriff lowered the gavel, scanning for the source. No one had seen him arrive. He wasn't from town, that much was certain. He sat atop a grizzled paint horse, coat draped in dust, hat low over his brow. His beard was touched with gray, though his shoulders held strong like a man who hadn't learned how to quit. A rifle was strapped to the saddle, but his hands rested easy on the reins. Strange implements hung from his belt, iron traps, coils of rope, a pouch that jingled with what sounded like bear claws. His eyes were fixed only on the boy. "I said 10, he repeated louder this time. "Name," the sheriff barked. "Ezekiel Cross." He dismounted slowly, boots heavy on the packed dirt. Someone in the crowd whispered, "Cross from Pine Ridge." "Ain't that the one who—" "Hush," came the answer. Ezekiel walked forward, each step measured. His gaze never left the child. Not the baby, the boy. "10's the high bid," the sheriff announced. "Unless someone wants 11. "Sold," Ezekiel said before the hammer fell. The sheriff hesitated. "You don't want to hear the rest? Boy's a thief. Girl's sick, likely more trouble than they're worth." Ezekiel nodded once. "Then I'll fit right in." Laughter rose again, but quieter now. The sheriff's lips curled into something sour. Still, a deal was a deal. He reached down to unshackle the boy, tossing the keys to Ezekiel. Billy didn't move. Ezekiel stepped close, crouched low and unlocked the irons himself. The boy flinched as the cuffs dropped, but he didn't run, didn't speak, just looked up with hollow eyes. Ezekiel looked back. "You got a name, son?" "Billy." "And hers?" "Mary." Ezekiel studied the baby. Her lips were chapped, eyes sunk deep. She stirred just slightly as he adjusted the feed sack, checking for warmth. "She needs milk," he said. "And sleep." "I tried," Billy mumbled. "Tried to find some." Ezekiel stood and held out a hand. Billy looked at it like it was a snake, but then slowly he reached out and took it. The square began to empty. Some folks shook their heads. Some muttered about fools and their charity, but none stopped him as Ezekiel led the boy and his sister toward the edge of town where a wagon waited, tethered to a sturdy mule. Billy climbed in, clutching Mary tight. Ezekiel handed him a wool blanket. "Wrap her good," he said. "We've got a ride ahead." "Where we going?" Billy asked, voice barely a whisper. "Home," Ezekiel said simply. They rode through the hills without much talk. Billy sat in the back, eyes darting to every branch and rock like the world might lunge at him again. Mary slept. Once she coughed, and Billy panicked, lifting her upright, patting her back. Ezekiel passed back a canteen and didn't say a word when half the water spilled in Billy's lap. By nightfall, the sky had turned dark as slate, stars hidden behind thick clouds. They stopped at a ridge where a lone cabin sat tucked beneath the pines. The place wasn't big, but it was sturdy. Smoke curled from the chimney. Strange pelts hung from the porch, bear, wolf, and something else Billy couldn't identify. Massive footprint casts lined the walls like trophies. Ezekiel didn't ask. He just lifted Mary into his arms and carried her inside. Billy followed close, hands twitching like he didn't know whether to fight or flee. Inside, the warmth hit fast. A fire crackled. The floor was swept. A table stood in the center with 2 chairs, neither used much. The walls were covered with maps, sketches of enormous footprints, and newspaper clippings about sightings of the beast. But Ezekiel set Mary in a cradle as if the strange surroundings were nothing more than furniture. It creaked gently beneath her weight. He ladled soup from a pot, poured it into 2 bowls, and set them on the table. Billy stared at the food like it might vanish. "Eat," Ezekiel said. "Ain't poisoned." Billy obeyed, spoon trembling in his fingers. He didn't look up until the bowl was nearly empty. "She's sick," he said finally. "Been coughing since the storm." "I'll fetch a doctor," Ezekiel said. "Come dawn." Billy's lip quivered. They didn't want her. Said she was just dead weight. Ezekiel's eyes didn't blink. "Then it's good I'm not them." That night, Billy didn't sleep much. He sat by the cradle, watching Mary's chest rise and fall. Every time her breath caught, he stiffened. Every time she stirred, he whispered to her. Ezekiel watched from the doorway. He remembered the sound of a child's cough. Remembered the silence that followed. Years back, he'd buried hope beside a grave marked by a small wooden cross, and hadn't spoken of it since. Now, watching Billy, something ached again. The boy had that look. The look of someone who'd run out of road but kept walking anyway. The look of someone who understood what it meant to be forgotten. Ezekiel stepped back into the hall, pulled a faded quilt from the shelf, and laid it gently over Billy's shoulders. By morning, the girl was worse. She wheezed softly, skin pale, lips blue. Ezekiel hitched the mule and rode into town alone. He returned an hour later with a doctor and 2 small glass bottles. The doctor didn't ask questions. He'd seen Ezekiel once before, years back, when a different child had been sick. Now he worked fast. "Keep her warm," he told Ezekiel. "1 drop every hour. If she makes it through the night, she'll likely pull through." Billy didn't ask what happened if she didn't. By sundown, the wind had picked up again. Clouds rolled low. Inside, the fire roared. Billy sat by Mary's side, counting seconds between her breaths. Ezekiel worked on his traps in the corner, quiet, steady, preparing for another hunt in the wilderness, always searching for the creature that had eluded him for so long. "You ain't going to send us back?" Billy asked suddenly. Ezekiel paused, hands still on the iron trap. "No. Even if she," his voice cracked. "Even then. No." The night dragged slow as molasses, but it wasn't sleep that blanketed the cabin. It was silence, heavy, waiting, the kind of hush that comes before the world decides whether to keep spinning or stop altogether. Mary wheezed in her sleep, her chest rising too slow, falling too shallow. Billy sat rigid beside her, back hunched, eyes dry. He hadn't cried, not once. But the set of his jaw, the way his small fists clenched into the wool blanket, they spoke louder than tears ever could. Ezekiel sat at the edge of the hearth, legs stretched toward the fire, one boot tapping slow against the floor. He didn't look at the boy, didn't say much, but every so often he'd glance toward the cradle, checking for breath. When Mary stirred, a tiny twitch, a faint cough, Billy leaned closer, holding his breath until hers resumed. Then he'd whisper something low, something Ezekiel couldn't hear, but understood all the same. A plea, a promise, the sound of a boy who had nothing left but a sister and refused to let go. By midnight, the wind had turned sharp, scraping branches against the windows like claws. The fire popped and spat embers, casting brief shadows across the wooden walls. Billy still hadn't moved. Ezekiel rose quietly, crossed the room, and laid a second quilt across the boy's shoulders. Billy didn't flinch. He didn't even acknowledge it. His eyes were locked on Mary, his whole body willing her to keep breathing. Ezekiel stood there a moment longer, then moved back to his chair. He reached for his carving knife again, drawing a thin block of cedar from the basket at his feet. His hands moved slow, methodical, shaving away layers of wood. He wasn't sure what he was carving yet. Maybe a bird, maybe a horse, something small, something solid, something that could fit into a child's palm and not fall apart. By dawn, Mary's wheezing had softened, not gone, but quieter. Her lips no longer looked blue. Her fingers twitched in sleep. Billy finally let out a breath that didn't shake. He didn't smile, he was too scared to, but something in his face softened just a little. Ezekiel brewed coffee in the old percolator, its hiss filling the cabin with the smell of warmth. He poured himself a mug, then filled a chipped cup with warm milk and brought it to Billy. "She'll wake soon," Ezekiel said. Billy blinked as if the words startled him. He took the cup with both hands, still careful not to jostle the cradle. "Thank you," he murmured, voice rough from too many silent nights. Ezekiel just nodded. They ate oatmeal that morning, plain but hot. Billy ate slowly, eyes flicking to Mary every few seconds. When she finally stirred, letting out a soft moan and blinking heavy eyes, Billy nearly dropped his spoon. He lunged for her, whispering her name over and over, kissing her tiny forehead with trembling lips. Ezekiel watched, expression unreadable. "She's okay," Billy whispered, as if saying it out loud might break the spell. "She's really okay." Ezekiel didn't say she wasn't out of danger yet. He just reached across the table and passed the boy a clean cloth. The days that followed settled into rhythm. Mornings were cold, but bright. Ezekiel rose early, fed the mule, chopped wood, and came inside with arms full of pine. Billy helped where he could, fetching water from the pump, tending to the small vegetable garden behind the cabin. He watched Ezekiel like a hawk, mimicking how he held tools, how he moved quiet through the brush, how he tied knots and set traps. But Mary, she stayed inside. She was better now. Not well, but better. She ate more, cried less, even smiled once when Ezekiel made a face behind Billy's back. Her cough came and went, but color had returned to her cheeks. Ezekiel made her a cradle out of old cherry wood, sanding it smooth and carving tiny stars into the headboard. Billy helped him polish it, working his fingers raw until it gleamed like firelight. Each evening, Ezekiel cooked while Billy read from the only book he knew, an old, tattered Bible missing half its cover and 3 pages from Psalms. He didn't read well, stumbling over big words. But Ezekiel never corrected him. He just listened, sometimes nodding, sometimes staring into the flames like he was chasing thoughts he couldn't catch. One night, as Billy closed the book and tucked it beneath his cot, he turned to Ezekiel. "Do you think God forgot about us?" Ezekiel didn't answer right away. He set his coffee down and leaned back in the chair, fingers steepled. "No," he said finally. "But I reckon sometimes he lets us find each other, even when it's hard." Billy nodded slowly, like he wanted to believe it, but wasn't sure if he could. Then he crawled under the blanket and slept hard for the first time without waking. Word traveled fast in a town like Deadwood Gulch. By the end of the week, folks knew where the boy had gone, knew who took him in, knew the girl was still breathing. Some scoffed, said it was a fool's errand. Others watched the ridge with wary eyes, wondering if Ezekiel Cross had finally cracked after all these years of chasing shadows in the wilderness. But one man did more than wonder. His name was Wade Garrett, and he had a badge now. He hadn't earned it, just inherited it when the last deputy got drunk and rode into a ravine. Wade was mean in a quiet way, the kind of man who remembered slights, counted debts, and hated being ignored. He'd bid on the boy too, had plans to use him for labor, maybe sell him again down the line. It wasn't about the child, it was about pride, and Ezekiel Cross had outbid him. Wade didn't forget things like that. He rode up to the cabin one afternoon without warning. No letter, no notice, just dust on his boots and spite in his veins. Ezekiel saw him coming from the ridge and didn't bother hiding his frown. He stepped out onto the porch, arms crossed. "You lost?" Ezekiel asked. Wade dismounted, dusting off his coat like he owned the place. "Just doing my rounds," he said. "Checking up on the boy, making sure you're not harboring a pair of runaways." "They ain't runaways," Ezekiel said flatly. "Town sold them to me." "Sure did, but that don't mean they stay yours. Council's been talking. Some folks think you ain't fit to raise a child, let alone two." Ezekiel didn't blink. "I'm not raising them. I'm giving them a roof." Wade's lip curled. "You think that's enough? Better than what you'd give." That landed. Wade stepped closer, boots creaking against the porch boards. "You got no wife, no kin, no claim to that boy or the girl. Ain't natural. And all this," he gestured at the footprint casts and pelts, "chasing monsters in the woods like some kind of madman." Billy stood just inside the doorway, holding Mary tight. Ezekiel didn't turn, didn't raise his voice. He just stepped between Wade and the door. "I didn't ask for your opinion." "Well, you're going to get it anyway," Wade snapped. "You keep them here fine, but don't cry when they get taken back. Might be the sheriff's word now, but the council's got longer arms than you think." Ezekiel stared hard. "Then they can ride up here themselves." Wade held his stare another second, then spit into the dirt and mounted his horse. "Suit yourself," he said. "But winter's coming, and I don't reckon hope keeps a child warm." He rode off, but the dust he stirred didn't settle. That night, Ezekiel packed extra wood inside. He checked the locks twice, sat longer by the fire than usual. Billy sensed something was wrong, but didn't ask. "Are they going to take us?" he whispered after Mary had fallen asleep. Ezekiel shook his head. "Not without a fight." Billy hesitated. Then he asked the question he'd been holding since day one. "Why'd you take us?" Ezekiel stared into the flames. "I was alone," he said finally. "Been hunting something that might not even exist for so long, I forgot what it was like to have something real to protect. Maybe that wasn't how it had to stay." The snow fell early that year, thick, wet flakes that clung to everything and turned the path to town into a ghost trail. Ezekiel kept the fire going day and night. He taught Billy how to chop kindling, how to split logs without losing fingers, how to listen to the wind and know when trouble was coming. But trouble didn't wait for wind. It came one night, fast and loud. 3 riders, no torches, just hooves and fists and the sound of wood splintering. The door cracked open with a scream of nails. Billy woke with a start, clutching Mary. Ezekiel was already up, rifle in hand. Wade was first through the door. He didn't smile, just barked. "By order of the council, we're taking the children." Ezekiel didn't move. "You got papers?" "Got something better," Wade growled. "Authority." 2 more men stepped inside, hands on pistols. Billy backed into the corner, Mary wailing now. Ezekiel's voice dropped, cold, sharp. "You take one more step, I swear before God, you'll regret it." Wade sneered. "You going to shoot us in front of the boy?" "If I have to." The standoff pulsed with heat. Mary's cries filled the silence. Then one of the men stepped forward. That's when Ezekiel fired. The shot cracked like thunder, not at a man, at the beam above their heads. Splinters flew. Dust choked the air. The riders ducked, cursed, stumbled back through the door. "Next one won't miss," Ezekiel warned. Wade glared, teeth bared. "This ain't over." "No," Ezekiel said, stepping forward. "It's just beginning." The night bled quiet once the hooves vanished into the trees. Ezekiel stood in the wreckage of the doorway, jaw tight, breath fogging in the cold. Outside, snow drifted gently through the light from the shattered lantern, soft as ash. But there was no softness in the room. Not in Ezekiel's stance, not in Billy's wide eyes, not in the cries Mary let out from her bundle of blankets, her tiny fists flailing at the cold. Billy didn't ask what had just happened. He didn't have to. He'd seen enough of the world to know the shape of men who came to take and never to give. Still, when he stepped forward, cradling Mary close, there was something different in the way he moved, slower, less frantic. For the first time, he knew someone had stood between them and danger. Not with empty words, not with promises, but with lead and steel. Ezekiel turned to face him. "Get her close to the fire," he said. "Keep her warm. I'll fix the door." Billy obeyed, and Ezekiel set to work. His hands were steady, deliberate. He pulled the broken frame back into place, hammered new nails through wood so cold it bit into his fingers. Each strike was a vow. They won't come through this way again. He barricaded the bottom, braced the latch with iron, reinforced the hinges. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but it would hold. Inside, Mary quieted, lulled by the heat and the sound of hammering. Billy sat curled around her, half asleep but alert, watching Ezekiel with the reverence of a boy watching someone become more than just a man, someone becoming safe harbor. Ezekiel didn't speak much that night. When he finally sat down, sweat beading at his brow despite the cold, he poured a mug of coffee and sat in the shadows. His rifle leaned against the wall beside him. He didn't relax, didn't close his eyes, just stared into the fire until dawn. Morning came dull and gray. No sun, just a pale sky pressing down on the earth like a second ceiling. The trees groaned with ice. The trail down the ridge was buried deep in snow, and still Ezekiel moved with purpose. He stoked the fire, fried what was left of the salt pork, and passed half the plate to Billy without a word. The boy didn't ask questions. He'd learned already that when the morning felt like a breath held too long, words could wait. Mary, though, let out a soft coo from her place beside the hearth. Her eyes blinked open, brighter than they'd been in days. Billy smiled for the first time, not a half smile, a real one. Ezekiel saw it, and something in him shifted. After breakfast, Ezekiel pulled a ledger from beneath the floorboards. It was old, leather-bound, pages wrinkled from years of damp and dust. Inside were notes, sightings, measurements, sketches of enormous footprints, dates when he'd lost the trail. Most entries were crossed out, leads that went nowhere. Billy peered over his shoulder. "What's that?" "Records," Ezekiel said. "From when I was still hunting." Billy hesitated. "Hunting what?" Ezekiel's jaw tightened. For a moment, it seemed he wouldn't answer. Then he said simply, "Something I lost." Billy didn't push. Later that day, they worked together. Billy shoveled paths through the snow, small arms struggling but determined. Ezekiel chopped wood, splitting logs so fast and clean it seemed the axe knew where to fall. When the sun dipped low again, they returned inside with numb fingers and red cheeks. Over dinner, Billy asked, "You ever think they'll come back?" Ezekiel nodded once. "They always do." "Then what'll we do?" Ezekiel looked at him hard. "Whatever we have to." Billy didn't answer, but he held his spoon tighter, jaw clenched like a boy trying to swallow more than soup. The next morning, the mail came. Not delivered, just tossed at the foot of the trail, soaked in snow and dirt. Ezekiel found it when he went to check the traps. Inside a battered envelope, folded 3 times and creased at the corners, was a single page. To Mr. Cross, the Council of Deadwood Gulch has decided that your recent behavior constitutes a breach of the social contract. You have no legal guardianship over the children in your care. Return them to the town by week's end. Failure to comply will result in legal action. Sincerely, Council Secretary, Office of Civil Order. Ezekiel read it twice. then folded it again and placed it in his coat. When he returned to the cabin, he didn't mention it. Billy noticed anyway. "You're quiet," he said. "I'm thinking," Ezekiel replied. "About us." Ezekiel nodded. Are you going to send us back?" Ezekiel looked up. His eyes, hard as granite, softened just slightly. "No," he said. "I'm going to town." He rode alone that evening, left Billy with a rifle, a pot of stew, and instructions not to open the door for anyone who didn't call his name. The boy nodded, clutching Mary and the weapon like lifelines. Ezekiel saddled his paint horse and rode down the ridge with the wind at his back and fury in his gut. He didn't stop at the sheriff's office. He went straight to the chapel. Pastor Williams was locking up when he arrived. The man was old, thin, with eyes like polished glass and hands that trembled more now than they used to. "Ezekiel," he said, surprised. "Been a while." "I need a witness," Ezekiel replied. The pastor didn't ask why. Just opened the chapel doors and led him to the front pew. There, by candlelight, Ezekiel took out the letter, placed it on the altar, and said quietly, "I want to make it legal." Pastor Williams blinked. "You mean adoption?" Ezekiel nodded. "If that's what it takes. I'm not giving them back." Williams studied him. "You know this won't stop them." "I know," Ezekiel said. "But it'll slow them, and it'll show that someone's willing to stand up." The pastor sighed. "The boy, he's not yours. He is now. And the girl." Ezekiel's voice faltered just once. "She reminds me of someone." The pastor understood. He nodded slowly, reached into a drawer, and pulled out a marriage register already yellowed with age. On the back were blank forms for guardianship, intended for orphans placed by the church. He filled it out as best he could, using Ezekiel's dictation. Billy's full name, Mary, ages, circumstances. He paused at the line for relation to guardian. Ezekiel said, "Put, by the grace of God." He returned to the cabin well past midnight. Billy was awake, rifle in hand, eyes fierce but steady. When he saw Ezekiel, he sagged with relief. "You're back. Told you I would be. Did you stop them?" Ezekiel nodded. "For now." He didn't show them the paper. Didn't need to. Instead, he walked over to the hearth, poured himself a mug of tea, and sat beside the cradle. Mary stirred in her sleep, letting out a soft sigh. Ezekiel watched her a long while. "She's stronger than she looks," he said. Billy nodded. "She always has been." There was pride in his voice now. Not fear, not worry, just pride. Ezekiel leaned back, his body aching from the ride, his heart sore from old wounds reopening. But he didn't mind. Not tonight. Because tonight there were 3 of them under that roof. And it wasn't just a cabin anymore. It was a home. But peace is a fragile thing. 2 days later, the sheriff came. He wasn't alone. Wade rode beside him, eyes gleaming. Behind them were 4 more men, all armed. They didn't knock, just dismounted and formed a line out front. Ezekiel saw them from the window. He turned to Billy. "Take her into the root cellar." Billy shook his head. "I'm not leaving. Now." The boy obeyed, clutching Mary tight, vanishing down the narrow trapdoor beneath the kitchen. Ezekiel waited until he heard the hatch close. Then he stepped outside, rifle across his back. The sheriff raised a hand. "We're here by council order." "You've got no claim," Ezekiel said. "We've got a judge's stamp," Wade sneered. "And a warrant." "Judge ain't here. But we are." Ezekiel's jaw flexed. "You planning to shoot me in front of a child?" "Don't have to," the sheriff said. "Just need you to hand them over." "No." Wade smirked. "Didn't think you would." He stepped forward. That's when the shot rang out. Not from Ezekiel's rifle. From behind the cabin. A single warning shot fired into the air. The men scattered, confused, reaching for their guns. But no second shot came. Just silence. Then a voice, "I wouldn't try it again." From the tree-line emerged a man, gray beard, long coat, rifle slung low and easy. Behind him, 3 more neighbors, homesteaders, folks who rarely spoke but always watched. One of them raised his hat to Ezekiel. "Heard there was trouble," he said. Ezekiel didn't smile, but his nod was slow and certain. "You heard right." Wade cursed under his breath. The sheriff looked around, saw the odds shift, and muttered, "Let's go." The riders turned, left again. This time, no threats, just dust. Ezekiel stood still long after they vanished. Only when the trees were quiet again did he open the cellar. Billy peeked out, eyes wide. "Is it over?" Ezekiel reached down and pulled him up. "For now," he said. "But we're not alone anymore." Snow piled thick against the windows, a slow and steady siege that crept higher by the hour, muffling the world outside. But inside the cabin, the fire crackled warm and strong, casting a golden halo over everything it touched. Wood grain, wool blankets, tired eyes, and soft hands. Mary slept in the cradle, breathing steady now, her cheeks pink from health and not fever. Billy sat beside her with a whittled bird in his palm, tracing the grooves Ezekiel had carved into its wings. He hadn't spoken much since the sheriff left. Neither had Ezekiel. Words, they'd both come to understand, didn't fix the kind of problems that rode up with guns and warrants, but they did hold weight when used right. So they used them sparingly with care. A nod here, a question there, a truth given only when it was ready to be heard. The morning after the standoff, Ezekiel made pancakes. Not because there was much to celebrate, flour was low, the eggs thin, but because sometimes a warm meal could do more than a sermon. Billy's eyes widened when the plate hit the table. 3 golden discs stacked high, steam rising like a blessing. Ezekiel poured syrup from a bottle that hadn't been touched in months. No words, just the clink of forks and the soft sigh of comfort returned. After breakfast, Ezekiel pulled Billy's coat from the peg and tossed it to him. "Bundle up," he said. "We got work." Billy stiffened. "More snow." "Always." He didn't ask more. He just obeyed, pulling on the coat, wrapping a scarf around his neck, and following Ezekiel out into the cold. They shoveled paths between the cabin and the barn, ice crunching beneath their boots. Ezekiel taught Billy how to read the snow by how it settled, how to test a drift with his boot before stepping in, how to listen for the creak that warned of a roof about to give. When they reached the chicken coop, they found 2 hens frozen stiff. Billy's face fell. "Didn't hear them," he muttered. "Storms take the quiet ones first," Ezekiel said. "Doesn't mean you weren't listening." Billy nodded, though it didn't ease the sting. They buried the birds in a shallow grave beneath a pine and moved on to the trough. Ice had sealed it thick. Billy swung the hatchet with all he had, but it only chipped at the edges. Ezekiel stepped in, guiding the boy's grip, teaching him where to strike. "Like this," he said. "Don't fight it. Just follow the grain." The ice cracked on the 5th swing. Billy grinned. By the time they returned to the cabin, their faces were red with cold and sweat, their hands sore, but alive. Mary was up, gurgling in her cradle. Billy ran to her, pressing his face against hers, murmuring nonsense that made her laugh. Ezekiel watched them from the doorway, his expression unreadable. Something deep stirred in his chest, something he hadn't felt since before he'd started chasing shadows in the wilderness. That night, as the wind howled through the pines and snow pressed against the windows like seeking fingers, Ezekiel sat by the fire with his old ledger open across his knees. But instead of studying the sketches of massive footprints and cryptic notes about the creature he'd been hunting for years, he found himself drawing something else entirely. A small hand. Billy's hand, wrapped around a wooden bird. The boy had fallen asleep in the chair beside Mary's cradle, one arm draped protectively over the side. His breathing was deep and even, the sleep of someone who finally felt safe. Mary cooed softly in her dreams, tiny fingers grasping at air. Ezekiel set down his pencil and closed the ledger. For the first time in years, the hunt seemed less important than what was right in front of him. "Ezekiel?" Billy's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes, son. Are we really staying?" Ezekiel looked at the boy, really looked at him. The hollow cheeks had filled out some. The fear in his eyes had been replaced by something cautious but warm. But maybe, or just the beginning of it. "We're staying," Ezekiel said. Billy nodded and closed his eyes again. But before sleep took him completely, he whispered, "Thank you." Ezekiel stayed awake long after the fire died down to embers. Outside, the storm raged, but inside there was warmth. There was family. And for the first time since he'd lost everything years ago, Ezekiel Cross wasn't hunting monsters in the darkness. He was home. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought more than just melting snow and budding trees. It brought visitors. Pastor Williams was the first to climb the ridge, his old mule struggling through the mud left by the thaw. He brought supplies, flour, salt, a bolt of cloth for Mary, and news from town. "Council's been quiet," he told Ezekiel as they sat on the porch, watching Billy teach Mary to crawl in the grass. Wade Garrett got himself thrown from a horse last month. Broke his arm in 2 places. Been real humble since. Ezekiel grunted. Humble don't last long on men like him. "Maybe not," Williams agreed. "But folks have been talking. About what you did. About those children." He paused, watching Mary grab at a dandelion with chubby fingers. "Some say you found your calling." Ezekiel didn't answer, but his eyes never left the children. More visitors followed. Neighbors Ezekiel barely knew stopped by with gifts, a carved toy horse, a jar of honey, warm bread. They didn't say much, but their message was clear: you're not alone. By summer, Billy had grown 3 inches and learned to read full sentences without stumbling. Mary took her first steps between the porch and the garden gate, squealing with delight as Billy cheered her on. The cabin felt smaller now, filled as it was with laughter and the chaos that comes with children. Ezekiel built an addition that fall, a proper bedroom for the children, with a window facing east so they could watch the sunrise. Billy helped, hammering nails with fierce concentration while Mary napped in a basket nearby. "You think she'll remember any of this?" Billy asked one afternoon as they worked on the roof. "What do you mean?" "Being sick. Being hungry. The auction." Billy's voice was steady, but Ezekiel could hear the worry underneath. "Maybe," Ezekiel said. "Maybe not. But she'll remember this." He gestured at the cabin, the garden, the life they'd built together. "She'll remember being loved." Billy nodded, satisfied. He went back to hammering, but after a moment he said, "I remember everything. The cold, the fear, thinking we were gonna die." He looked up at Ezekiel. "But mostly now I remember you saying we could stay." That winter was gentler than the last. The snows came late and light, and the cabin stayed warm. Ezekiel told stories by the fire, tales of the wilderness, of tracking and hunting, but also of kindness found in unexpected places. Billy listened with rapt attention, and Mary clapped her hands at the exciting parts, even though she was too young to understand the words. On Christmas Eve, Pastor Williams climbed the ridge again, this time bringing half the congregation with him. They sang carols on the porch while snow fell soft around them, their voices carrying across the valley like a promise that no one had to face the darkness alone. Later, after the visitors had gone and the children were asleep, Ezekiel sat alone by the dying fire. In his hands was the old ledger, but tonight he wasn't looking at maps or sketches of mysterious creatures. He was reading the adoption papers Pastor Williams had helped him file properly with the territorial court. William Cross. Mary Cross. His children. Legally, officially, and in every way that mattered. He closed the book and looked toward their bedroom, where he could hear Billy reading quietly to Mary, the same tattered Bible they'd had that first night, but with new pages Pastor Williams had brought to replace the missing ones. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, but it no longer sounded lonely. It sounded like home. Years passed. Billy grew tall and strong, learning to track and hunt alongside Ezekiel, but also to read and write and cipher numbers. Mary grew into a spirited little girl with dark curls and a laugh that could chase shadows from any room. The cabin expanded again. A proper kitchen, a sitting room, spaces for a family that had learned to thrive. The people of Deadwood Gulch stopped asking questions about the strange tracker on Pine Ridge. They stopped calling him strange at all. Children in town grew up hearing the story of the man who'd bid $10 for 2 orphans at an auction and found something worth more than all the gold in the mountains. Wade Garrett left town eventually, nursing grudges that ate at him like poison. The sheriff retired, replaced by a younger man who had no quarrel with anyone. The world moved on as worlds do. But on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the fire burned low, Ezekiel would sometimes take out his old ledger and show Billy and Mary the sketches he'd made in those early days, the maps that led nowhere, the footprints of creatures that might never have existed at all. "Were you really hunting monsters, Papa?" Mary would ask, settled in his lap like she belonged there. "I thought I was," Ezekiel would answer. "Turns out I was just lost." "But then you found us," Billy would say. "No," Ezekiel would correct him, ruffling the boy's hair. "You found me." And in the warmth of that cabin, surrounded by the family he never thought he'd have, Ezekiel Cross finally understood the truth. Sometimes the greatest hunt of all is the one that leads you home. The tracker's heart had found what it was searching for all along.